Hello and welcome back to Age of the Classics. As always, I'm your host Bert, and today we are looking to continue the story of Huckleberry Spencer. Where last we left off, Spencer had a big old adventure with the steamboat running down the river. Well, let's see what he gets into today. Chapter 7, Lost in the Fog. The next day, Jim and I looked at the things from the men's boat. There were boots, clothes, and a lot of books. I read some of the books to Jim. I read about kings and dukes, and Jim really loved hearing those stories. "I didn't know there were so many kings," he said. "How much money does a king get?" "They get $1,000 a month if they want it," Spencer told him. "Everything belongs to them." Then Jim asked, "What do they do?" "They don't do anything," Spencer said. "Sometimes they go hunting, and sometimes they'll start a war or something." Then Spencer told him about King Louis XVI of France, and they cut off his head. He died, and his son went to prison too, and well, he died. "That's terrible." "Some people say he escaped from prison. They say he came to America," Spencer told him. Jim asked, "What do kings do in America?" Spencer said, "Well, they get a job with the police or something, or maybe they teach French." Jim said, "Huck, don't the French speak the same language as us?" "No, they speak French," Spencer told him. Well, Jim didn't believe Spencer. It's not right to speak different languages. So Spencer said to Jim, "Do cats talk the same language we do?" No, they don't." "And do dogs talk the same as we do?" "I guess not." "So," Spencer said, "why is it different for the French? Can't they speak different from us?" Jim said, "Cat isn't a man, dog ain't a man, but the French, they're supposed to be men. They should talk like us." Well, Spencer stopped then. Jim wasn't very smart, and he knew this was a little difficult for him. Anyway, that night the river was covered in fog. They were about 3 days from Cairo at the bottom of Illinois, and they couldn't see nothing. It was too dangerous to be on the river, so they got in a canoe and pulled the raft to the side of the river. Then they tied the raft to the tree, but the tree was too small and the raft pulled it out. The raft with Jim on it started moving down the river. Well, for half a minute, Spencer's too worried to do anything. Then he got in his canoe and he paddled as quick as he could to catch up with Jim, but the raft disappeared into the fog. Spencer called out to Jim, "Jim!" Well, Spencer could hear a small shout far away, and he felt a little better. Jim was okay. But where was he? Spencer shouted again, "Jim!" This time, the answer came from behind him. Well, Spencer shouted again, and the answer came from his right. This was bad news. Spencer was getting all turned around, and now he was lost too. Spencer stopped paddling and he just listened. Sometimes Jim was in front of him, then he was behind him. Well, then Spencer understood what was happening. He was near an island, and Jim was on the other side of the island, and he was moving faster than Spencer. In the dark, it felt like Spencer wasn't even moving, but he was. Sometimes he'd hit the side of the river, and that turned his canoe around. Soon, he was back in the middle of the river, and he shouted again, but Jim didn't answer. Spencer tried again and again. "Jim, where are you? Jim!" But no reply. Spencer was feeling real tired, and he wanted to sleep real bad. But Spencer told himself he'd only sleep for 20 minutes. Then he had to get up and find Jim. Well, Spencer slept for more than 20 minutes. When Spencer woke up, the stars were out shining brightly. The sky was clear. So Spencer went to find Jim. After a short time, he saw something in the river and paddled over to it. But when he got over to it, it was just an old piece of wood. Well, Spencer did that a couple more times before he found the raft. When he got to it, Jim was sitting there asleep. So Spencer tied the canoe to the raft, got on the raft real quiet and lay down. Then Spencer said, "Look, Jim, have I been asleep?" Jim said, "Hook, is that you? You're not dead?" "No, you're not. Oh, I was so worried about you." Spencer started playing with him. "What's the matter, Jim? You're talking crazy. What you talking about?" Jim said, "You were lost in the fog last night. I called to you. That's what I'm talking about." "That's real crazy," Spencer said. "Jim, I know you love telling stories, but I was with you last night. I was right here asleep." "Huck, are you saying there was no fog last night?" "What fog?" Spencer said. "The fog. The fog that I got lost in. The fog that you were in. You shouted, I shouted. That fog." Spencer said, "Jim, you must have been dreaming." "Maybe I did dream it, but it was real. I never had a dream as real as that before." Well, this was good fun for Spencer. Jim really believed him. Well, then Spencer told him it was just a joke. He really was lost in the fog last night, and that made him real angry. He said, "Why you was joking about that, Spencer? I thought you was my friend." "Well, a friend don't joke nothing like that." Then Jim went back into the tent. Spencer felt bad. It was about 15 minutes before Jim would talk to Spencer again. Spencer was real sorry about the joke then. Well, it was close to Cairo now, and Jim was getting excited. He said, "When he gets to Cairo, I'll be a free man. They don't have no slaves there." Every time they passed a light, Jim jumped up and said, "Look, it's Cairo. I'm a free man." Well, Spencer told Jim, "In the morning, I'm going to ask somebody what town that is." But that same night, two men came over in a boat. They had guns too. One of them said, "Who over there?" Spencer said, "It's me and my raft." "Are there any men on that raft?" "Only one," Spencer said. "We're looking for 5 runaway slaves. Is that man on your raft white or black?" he asked. "He's white," Spencer answered. "I think I'll check." "Please do," Spencer said. "It's Pap that's with me. Maybe you can take him into town. Pap real sick, and so is Ma and my sister Mary Ann." Well, they agreed to help and started paddling over to Spencer and them. Well, that's when Spencer said, "It's so good of you to help. I talked to a lot of people, but nobody wanted to help." "Well, that wasn't very nice of them," said the man. "What's the problem with your Pap?" It's nothing really." Then they stopped paddling. "That's a lie, boy," the man said. "What is the problem with your Pap? And I want a true answer this time." "I'll tell you, sir, but first come and help us get us to town." "Stop the boat!" the man shouted. "You keep away, boy. If your Pap's so sick, I don't want to come near him. You go about 20 miles down the river and you'll find a town. They can help you there." Then he said, "You have any money, boy?" "No, sir," Spencer said. "Here's $20. That'll pay for the doctor." The man put the money on a piece of wood and pushed it over to Spencer. Well, Spencer said, "Thank you very much, sir. I'll remember what you told me. Bye." They both said, "Good luck." When they was gone, Spencer looked for Jim. He wasn't in the tent, so Spencer shouted for him, "Jim, where you be?" "Here I am," answered Jim. He was in the river, only his head was above the water. He got back on the raft and said, "I heard the men coming and I jumped right in the river. I didn't want them to find me. I was going to swim away. But you tricked him, Huck. That was a good story. You saved my life. Nobody ever helped me like that. You're the best friend I have, Spencer." Well, they talked about the money. Jim said, "I'm a free man, so I'll buy a ticket on a steamboat." The next morning, they hid the raft and went to town. Spencer asked a man, "Is this town Cairo?" "No," the man said. "You going past Cairo." So they got back on the raft and told Jim. He wasn't a free man now, and well, Spencer felt real bad about going past it. But Jim said, "Huck, it's okay. I'll be free someday. Don't you worry none." Well, they slept all day, and the next night the fog came again. Jim and Spencer were talking on the raft. They couldn't see anything, but then they heard a steamboat. She was coming up the river, and they couldn't see her. Sound got louder, and then they saw her. She was coming straight for them. She was coming fast, too. Well, Jim, he jumped off the raft, and Spencer, he jumped right off, too. They swam straight down because they didn't want the boat to hit them. Well, Spencer must have been under the water for like a minute and a half. And when he came up, he was calling for Jim. Jim didn't answer. Spencer started looking for the raft, but it was in pieces. That steamboat put it into pieces, just destroyed it. Well, Spencer couldn't do anything about that, so he swam about 2 miles inside of the river, and when he climbed out, he started looking for Jim again. Spencer shouted for him, but Jim didn't answer. This time, Spencer was sure Jim was dead. Chapter 8, Huck meets a duke and a king. Well, Spencer was alone for a long time, and he couldn't find Jim or his old canoe, and he didn't really know what to do. Then one day he was walking in the woods and he heard a voice. "Is that you, Huck?" It was Jim. Nothing ever sounded so good. Spencer ran to him and Jim kissed Spencer on the head. "I thought you were dead," Spencer said. Well, Jim, he had a new raft and he'd even got us some food. So they went down the river and talked. Raft is the best home, they both agreed. You feel free on a raft. And the new raft was right comfortable too. Well, for 2 or 3 days they rested on the raft. River was real big now. It was about 1.5 miles wide in some places. Well, they slept in the daytime, and at night they went down the river. Some nights they didn't see anybody. They just sat and looked at the stars. "What are they made of?" asked Jim. But Spencer didn't know. One day, Spencer found a new canoe and went to the side of the river. As Spencer was paddling near the woods, 2 men ran toward him. He was worried. He thought it was their canoe he was in. Then one of the men shouted, "Help! They're going to kill us!" Though it wasn't their canoe. Spencer wasn't worried after that. So he stopped and they jumped in. Spencer paddled real quick, and one of the men, he looked about to be 7 years old. Didn't have a hair on his head, and he had a gray beard. Older man looked about 30 maybe. Well, they got back to the raft and they all ate breakfast together. "Who you be?" Spencer asked. Young man said, "I can tell you, but you won't believe me. I'm a duke, the Duke of Bridgewater." Jim's eyes got real big. He couldn't believe it. A real duke on his raft. "That's wonderful," said the old man. "Then you and I have said similar lives." Well, they all looked at the old man, and he said, "I'm the son of Louis the 16th. My father was killed and I escaped to America. Now I live like this." He looked at himself and began to cry. Jim didn't know what to do. He had a king and a duke on his raft. He didn't know what to do for a king. "You should go down on one knee when you talk to me, and always feed me first at dinner." Well, so Jim and Spencer started doing everything for the king. They went down on their knees all the time. King liked that, and the duke liked it too. Spencer soon understood. These men weren't really a king or a duke. But Jim was real happy about it, so Spencer didn't say nothing. They asked about Jim. "He's my slave," Spencer told them. "We're going to my father's farm downriver. People try to take Jim away from me. They think he's a runaway. So we got some travel at night." Well, the duke had an idea. He opened his bag and took out a piece of paper. On it he wrote $200 reward. Then he wrote a description of Jim. He said, "Now we can travel in the daytime. If anybody asks about him, we'll show him the piece of paper. We're taking him back to his farm. We should tie Jim's hands and feet. Then nobody asks no questions." Well, they all thought that was a good idea. Chapter 9, The King's Success. Well, they traveled together for a couple days, and the Duke's idea was good. They traveled in the daytime and didn't have no problems. "I like to work in the theater," the king told us. "We can stop in the next town and do a play for them." Well, the Duke made a sign for the play. It said, "Starting tomorrow, for 3 nights only, the famous David Garrick and Edmund Kean from London in The King's Success. Entrance, 50 cents. Then at the bottom in big letters it said, "Ladies and children not welcome." The next day the king worked hard. He put up a big tent, and inside the tent he made a stage. And he was ready. That night a lot of people came. The Duke took their money at the door and he went on to the stage. He told the people about the play and the king. Then the show began. Everyone was quiet. Then the king came on stage. He was on his hands and knees, and he wasn't wearing any clothes. He was painted in many different colors. The people laughed and laughed. Spencer laughed too. He looked so funny. Then the king left the stage. The people shouted, "More! Give us more!" Well, he had to do it again and again. The Duke came out and thanked everybody. They shouted, "Is that all?" Then they got real angry, wanted to kill the Duke and the king. But one man said, "Wait, wasting everybody? We was tricked by these 2 men. But we can't go home now. People gonna laugh at us. Tomorrow, we tell everybody about this show. Tell them to see it tomorrow night. Then we trick them." Well, they all agreed to this. So the next night, there were even more people at the show. And the same thing happened. On the 3rd night, the tent was full again. This time, everybody from the town was there, and they had eggs and old vegetables in their pockets. They planned to throw them at the king. But that Duke, he sure was a smart man. He gave a boy 25 cents to watch the entrance. Then he and Spencer walked to the back of the tent. Then he said, "Run! Run as fast as you can." They all took off and went back to the raft. When they got back to the raft, they didn't wait for the king. They left quick as they could. Spencer felt bad for the king. Those people were real right angry. Then Spencer heard a voice from inside the tent. "How much money did we make?" it said. It was the king. He's on the raft the whole time. He never even went into town. Well, two men counted their money. They made $465 in 3 nights. Jim and Spencer couldn't believe it. Jim said to me, "They must be a king and a duke, but they sure ain't very honest." But Spencer told him about kings in the books. Kings were always like that. Chapter 10, The Funeral. Well, they traveled all the next day, and Jim was still tied up in the tent. That evening, he started talking to the Duke. "I don't like this. It hurts." "Oh, think of another idea," said the Duke. He was a smart man, and soon he had a new idea. He gave Jim some theater clothes that the king used. Then he painted Jim's face blue, and he wrote a sign. It said, "This is a sick Arab, but he probably won't hurt you." Spencer was right scared when he saw Jim. He thought it was a good idea. King bought everybody new clothes with the money from the king's success. They still wore their old clothes on the raft, but when they went on to town, they put on their new ones. Well, the Duke wanted to make more money, and he needed to think. So he wanted to be left alone. So Spencer went to town with the king. Well, they put on their new clothes and left in the canoe. They paddled toward town. Near the town, they met a young man who was waiting for a steamboat to New Orleans. Well, they stopped and offered him a ride to town. Then he said, "Are you Mr. Wilkes?" "No," said the king. "My name is Blodgett, Alexander Blodgett. What tell me about Mr. Wilkes? Is it an interesting story?" So the young man told us about Mr. Wilkes. His first name was Harvey, and he came from England. His brother Peter lived here in town, but he died the day before. The dead man left a lot of money to Harvey Wilkes. Mr. Wilkes wasn't there yet. Then the young man told us about the dead man's family. Peter Wilkes had 3 daughters. The oldest daughter's name was Mary Jane. The young man talked about the dead man's farm and his money. And he told us about the dead man's older brother, William. William couldn't hear or speak. Nobody knew Harvey or William. That was because they lived together in England. The king listened very carefully to the story and asked a lot of questions. He wanted to know everything about everybody and everything. Well, after a long time, they said goodbye to the young man, and he left on the steamboat. Then the king told me to go back to the raft. He said, "Go get the Duke. Tell him to come here, and come now, and to tell him to bring the bags." Well, Spencer got the Duke and the bags, and the Duke didn't ask no questions. When they found the king, he said, "Hello." But he sounded strange because he was talking like an Englishman. "Duke," he said, "my name is Harvey Wilkes, and you're my brother William. You can't hear or speak. Can you do that?" "I can," the Duke said. Well, it was about 5 miles from town when a steamboat came and they stopped it. They got on and went to town. There were a lot of people in town. The king said, "Can someone please tell us where Mr. Peter Wilkes lives?" He spoke like an Englishman. Well, one man said softly, "I'm sorry, sir, I can't tell you where he lives, 'cause he died yesterday evening. The funeral's tomorrow." The king looked real sad. He had turned to the Duke and made some signs with his hands, and the Duke dropped his bags, and then he started to cry. Well, Spencer felt sick. Spencer knew what they was planning, but they couldn't say nothing because they didn't want to get in trouble. Well, people came around the king and the duke and said nice things. Then they took him to the dead man's house. When we got to the house, the three daughters were waiting. Mary Jane kissed the king and the duke. She was real pretty. She had red hair and a very kind face. Then the king made a speech about his poor dead brother. He remembered everything that the young man told him. He even remembered all the names. Mary Jane left the room and came back with a letter from her dead father. She gave it to the king. There were $6,000 under the house, the letter said. So the king and the duke went to find it. They found it real easy. The duke counted the money, but there were only $5,585. Where was that other $415? The king was worried. They'll think we've stolen the $415. But the duke had an idea. He said, let's put our money with it. That'll make $6,000. The king thought this was a good idea. So they went back to the house and counted the money in front of everybody. And the king gave another speech. He said, this letter's from my brother. It says the money is for William and me. But William and I want to give this money to Mary Jane and her sisters. They'll need it. Well, the three sisters kissed the king and the duke. They were real happy. Only the doctor looked worried. He didn't believe the duke nor the king. Next, Mary Jane said, Uncle Harvey, you're real sweet like. Thank you for the money, but please keep it for us. If we ever need it, we'll ask you. Well, the king was real polite. He agreed to keep the money, and the king suggested that the girls come back to England with him. He said we can sell the house and the slaves and we all go to England tomorrow. Everybody thought it was a good idea, so they all went to bed thinking about it. King hid the money under his bed and went to sleep. Spencer couldn't sleep because he felt so bad for Mary Jane and their sisters. Spencer couldn't tell him about the duke or the king. But then Spencer had an idea. While the king was asleep, he took the money. Spencer went downstairs and he hid it. When Spencer was going back to bed, he saw Mary Jane. She was in her bedroom crying. And Spencer felt real bad for her, so he decided to tell her about the king and the duke. Spencer went to the room and said, Miss Mary Jane, I don't like to see people cry. Then Spencer said, Miss Mary Jane, those uncles of yours aren't really your uncles. They're bad men. They only want to steal your money. Well, she was real angry. What can I do? She asked. You should visit some friends for a few days. Then, when the men have gone, you can call the police. Mary Jane agreed to leave with her sisters after the funeral. Then Spencer sat down and wrote a letter. It said, Miss Mary Jane, your money is with your dead father. I saw you sitting with him last night and you was crying. I was hiding behind the door. I put the money in later. Spencer gave her the letter and said, don't read this until those two men are gone. When the king couldn't find the money, he was real angry. Did you steal it? He asked me. Of course not, Spencer said. And King believed him. That morning he sold the slaves in the house and didn't get much money for them, but he didn't worry about that because he was still angry about that whoever stole that $6,000. Well, but a little money was better than no money, and now they could get away from the town. In the afternoon they all went to the funeral. The church was full and everybody sat quiet. Well, they sang and the king said some nice words and a lot of people cried, and they all went back to the house. We have to leave you now, the king told Mary Jane. Mary Jane said, we have to visit some friends before we go with you to England. We'll meet you later. So the king, the duke, and I went to the river and waited for a steamboat. When it came, two men got off. One of them said,
I am Pretty Rick's brother, Harvey. This is my brother, William.
He spoke like a real Englishman. Things went right crazy after that. People asked the men a lot of questions, and they looked angrily at the king and the duke. Everybody was watching them, and they forgot about Spencer. So Spencer walked away slowly and quietly. Then he started to run, and he ran all the way to the river. When Spencer got to the raft, he shouted for Jim. Jim come out of the tent, and Spencer was real scared when he saw him. Spencer had forgotten that he was dressed as a crazy Arab. And then Spencer said, "We gotta go right now." Then Spencer heard voices. It was the king and the duke. Spencer almost cried. Spencer never wanted to see them again. They got on the raft and they all went down the river. This concludes this week's reading of Age of the Classics, Huckleberry Spencer. Join us next time for Chapter 11, Where's Jim? As always, we thank you for joining us. And remember, if it's not a classic and it's not an age, it's not Age of the Classics. Thank you and have a good day.